When Francis of Assisi kisses festering wounds and does not even kill the bugs that bite him, but leaves his body to them as a hospitable home, these acts, if seen from the outside, could be signs of perverted instincts and of a perverted valuation. But that is not actually the case. It is not a lack of nausea, or a delight in the pus which makes Saint Francis act this way. He has overcome his nausea through a deeper feeling of life and vigor. This attitude is completely different from that of recent modern realism in art and literature, the exposure of social misery, the description of little people, the wallowing in the morbid, a typical ressentiment phenomenon. Those people saw something bug-like in everything that lives, whereas Francis sees the holiness of life even in bug.
This is a very good conversation to have, and the follow up to the one I just recently had with our friend George, who joined the podcast. I don't know if you watched that, where we talked about Ray Peat, bioenergetics, and theosis. And yeah, that he was talking about Nietzschean perspectives versus Christian vitalism. And it sounds kind of, Nietzsche is talking about the same phenomenon you're talking about. These, what is it that guy Bap calls the bugmen? Did he get that from that quote?
So I joked about that. I noticed that when I first read it, I was like, this sounds like the Bugman that Bap coined, the term Bugman that Bap coined, and it really is. It's describing the same thing. The people who see something bug-like in everything that lives, those are Bugmen. The people that see something bug-like in everything that lives. And what Max Scheler does in this book is defend Christianity against the Nietzschean criticism of being founded on ressentiment, which is a psychological phenomena, ressentiment, that I could explain if you wanted. But so in his defense of Christianity, he has this quote about Francis of Assisi, who is known for his kind of radical acts of self abnegation, you could say. And he says, even in the case of Saint Francis, who's known for these radical acts of poverty, of self renunciation, that seem almost like just totally upside down behavior, that seem totally a rejection of instincts of cleanliness and of nobility and of being above the fray of the filth and grime of the world. Even in the case of Francis, he is not uh, his disposition is not the result of ressentiment, but is the result of an overflowing life, which means he's immune from normal disgust responses and stuff like that. So it's a very fantastic book, and that quote there really like summarizes the rejoinder he gives to a lot of Nietzschean perspectives.
How did you get into Max?
So that's a good question. So I was in Africa at the time. I was in Sierra Leone, and I put out a tweet saying something like, if there was ever a union of Christianity and Nietzsche, it was through the pen of Nikolai Berdyaev, who's one of these Russian philosophers, 20th century philosophers, Nikolai Berdyaev.
Surat Dasgupta is a writer at neighborschoice.com, and he writes about Berdyaev a lot. He likes him.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'll check that out. Yeah, Berdyaev is a fascinating character, and these kinds of Russians from that period need more people to read them and need more attention paid them because they're really worth it. But this German character was mentioned to me by someone in the comment under my tweet, and he said you could also look at in addition to Nikolai Berdyaev, you could also look at Max Scheler, who is really kind of synthesizing Nietzsche and Christianity from a certain perspective. So what he's doing in this book, when I checked it out, one of the things that really struck me about it is he's really taking on board as much of Nietzsche as he possibly can, because he sees Nietzsche. He has this quote here. Uh, he says, this is a fantastic quote. He says, among the scanty discoveries which have been made in recent times about the origin of moral judgments, Friedrich Nietzsche's discovery that ressentiment can be the source of such value judgments is the most profound. This remains true even if his specific characterization of Christian love, as the most delicate flower of ressentiment, should turn out to be mistaken. So he concedes that Nietzsche's discovery that ressentiment can be the origin of moral systems, ethical systems, and value judgments is genius. He says it's one of the most genius recent discoveries, and he was writing 100 years ago. He's saying it's the most genius recent discovery. However, his understanding of Christian love as being rooted in ressentiment is incorrect. And so what he's doing is developing in this book, Ressentiment, which me and my friends have been going through on my Substack. What he's doing in this book is explicating and developing Nietzsche's understanding of ressentiment as a psychological phenomenon, and simultaneously decoupling Christianity from that and showing how they're two different phenomena. The phenomena of Christian love and the phenomena of ressentiment are not the same thing, even though they can kind of blur together. So basically, his view is that ressentiment, as Nietzsche describes it, which I could go into if you want, ressentiment, as Nietzsche describes it, is essentially a skin suit of Christianity. It can kind of skin suit Christian rhetoric of the love for the poor and the weak and the marginalized. It can skin suit this rhetoric, but it fundamentally is of a different spirit entirely than Christian love. Christian love is something different and has a different origin than ressentiment.
Go on, go ahead.
So that was what really struck me about him. Yeah, so ressentiment, and you can see this in a lot of ways, this is a kind of addendum to Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, which is maybe his most systematic work. Um, Basically, in the Genealogy and in Max Scheler's book here, Ressentiment, uh, well, first of all, a note about the term, right? Ressentiment is related to our English word resentment, but it has a slightly different connotation. Ressentiment in French, uh, has a different connotation than the English term ressentiment. It has a thicker connotation. It has more weight. It means something a little more systemic about a person than just resentment does in English. Um, and so when Nietzsche is, writing his works, particularly the genealogy, he can't find any German equivalent for the term. So he just borrows the French term. And thus, in philosophy subsequent, they just all use Nietzsche's term, which is the French term he borrowed, which is ressentiment. Ressentiment is essentially a phenomena that emerges when someone encounters something in someone else that exceeds their own capacity, right? So they could basically, you see someone who's more beautiful than you, more powerful than you, uh, more healthy than you, can do something you can't, basically. They have something you don't have. It can be, that they're more wealthy than you, but the more inborn the characteristics are that you see in them that you don't have, the more it's a ripe ground for ressentiment to take hold. So that's one of the things. You see someone who has something that you don't have, and you feel bitter against them as a result of it. So it's kind of in one level you could just say it emerges from envy, from spitefulness, from a desire for revenge. These are all kind of the emotions that can become ressentiment, but ressentiment is more than that. So it's a kind of desire for revenge against someone who has something you don't. That's ressentiment. But what happens in over the course of the development of this phenomena is it stops being a desire for revenge against someone in particular over some particular quality and morphs into just a general ambiance of your psychology where you basically feel inadequate. The world itself as a whole, or some large part of the world, has made you feel inadequate, and you want to lash out against the world and against really reality itself for making you feel inadequate. And so what happens subconsciously is that someone devalues whatever that good quality is they see outside of themselves, whether it's in another person, especially in other people. They'll deny the value of that quality in order to kind of soothe themselves. It's cope. It's a coping mechanism. So a good example that Shaler uses is the Aesop's fable of the fox and the grapes, right? The fox tries to leap up and grab the grapes, but he physically can't jump high enough. That physical deficiency element is important there. He physically cannot jump high enough to reach the grapes. And so what does he do? He skulks off and says, "Well, those grapes weren't sweet anyway," right? So that's where ressentiment takes hold. It's not just seeing something someone has that you don't. It's then devaluing that thing because you don't have it. So it's someone who says, say someone, and there's a lot of people like posting about this on the internet recently, like, oh, I'm a brown girl, and when I went to school, I always felt inferior to like the pretty blonde girls, right? So, um, but then basically the next move, so that's just noticing someone has a quality you don't, a desirable quality, a good quality. what ressentiment does is it devalues that thing. So you end up saying, um, blonde girls aren't even pretty, or being muscular isn't even pretty. Being wealthy is not even good. You end up denying all these qualities their proper value. And so that's ressentiment. It's basically a psychological atmosphere that develops in a person where, as a result of their own inadequacies, they redefine subconsciously and consciously to a certain extent, they redefine what is good and what is desirable on the basis of their own inadequacy. So if they're weak, if they're sick, if they're sexually impotent, if they're bad with women, if they're any number of these things, they basically say, well, those things aren't good to begin with. That's ressentiment, and then this becomes their kind of modus operandi for being in reality as a whole. So they end up detracting from the goodness of certain qualities simply on the grounds that they don't have them themselves.
Yeah, and that's something we talk a lot about through this program and engaging Nietzsche's impact on our society and the phenomenon that he's rightly identifying. I was thinking about, that is to the T almost everything about the credo of our culture. It is all about justifying and making excuses for and lionizing and even sacralizing ressentiment. And we've talked about it a lot over the years in the context of Rene Girard's work and others around that circle. It's clear that that is the reigning religion. Rene called it victimism, which is a little bit different. It's, I mean, these are similar things, but victimism is this kind of outgrowth of that attitude, and it turns to this victim Olympics, and using violence in the name of victims, using coercion in the name of victims, otherizing and dehumanizing people, and this zero sum mentality is always the driving kind of framework that motivates all of this. And you see that with what they tried to do and are still trying to do by calling it toxic whiteness, that like your skin tone is pathological, and trying to turn, this kind of, showing up on time for work is toxic whiteness. Remember that one? Physics is toxic whiteness. Like like you said, anything becomes just this generalized pathological outlook. Uh, and then from that, you have an entitlement mentality that, and you see that kind of work. This is not cut and dry. You see it. I mean, I think a little bit of that is uh, in the critique that a lot of the online right have towards Vivek, even though Vivek is also wrong and has the same phenomenon going back towards his counterparts, but they also are kind of uh, tainted with that vibe as well. This kind of uh, all pervasive learned helplessness that requires this kind of, well, I hate you anyways. And you see that with a lot of Fuentes's fans, elevating the idea of it's fake and gay to get married just because so many people do marriage wrong, therefore, and it's difficult, therefore I don't have it, therefore I hate it, and or I
Right.
fear it and I
Yeah.
hate it. So you see it all over the place.
No, those are great observations. I think that's true. I think there is that reactionary movement in that direction where uh so I'm kind of sympathetic to the incel types. I mean I'm of that generation, so I understand their angst. I don't mean that in a belittling way. Like I really deeply like uh feel on that same I have sympathy with them. Um, in many ways, like I'm on the team of the incels, but I do observe that tendency among them where they feel, that women are either they feel women are inaccessible, or maybe they actually are inaccessible to them for whatever reason, and then therefore they deny the value of women entirely. That could be a ressentiment phenomena. That could actually genuinely be an expression of ressentiment, because there's that transvaluation, as Nietzsche calls it, where you basically redefine value in accordance with your own inadequacy. So that could be ressentiment. On the other hand, the dating market, the sexual marketplace is totally out of whack, totally bizarre. And there have been catastrophic changes to that in recent years that really I'm not sure have precedent in a lot of, at least for decades and decades, there's not precedent, in terms of the way in which the dating market has been changed and the way in which the internet and mass communication has made beautiful women accessible to an increasingly small, like quintile or whatever of men, increasingly small quotient. It's increasingly competitive. I saw this video. Um, uh, I wish I could. There's this video of this. It's from this TikTok from this Asian girl. And she's like lives in SoCal, and it's this video of her boyfriend. Like, and she's like, I'm convinced this is the hottest guy, and he's like some like really handsome, tall white dude who has some kind of high-paying job, and he's like just a total winner, right? And she the kind of TikTok ends by her saying, and he's into me somehow. And it just shows you like how distorted the dating market is. Like, and she's some kind of like average looking like Asian girl, right? No offense to her, but it's like it's just kind of a bizarre pairing. I mean, and that's she recognizes that too. That's the whole point of the video. So in many ways, like there is like, in defense of the incels, we are kind of dealing with an unprecedented sexual situation. To your point, though, absolutely, there are people who have this mentality that if I can't have something, it must be bad. And that is characteristic, like ressentiment phenomena to a T.
That's where you get terms like white privilege or heteronormativity or cisgender, all these kind of pathological, this attempt to pathologize and otherize things that can't be attained because whatever, you can't change your race or whatever, and you can't truly change your gender, and you can't change, you can't change these things. So, um, the more, and Rene Girard talks about that, right? The closer you become, the more likely you are to have rivalry. The more we lose borders between nations with globalism and trade and communications and AI, borders between what is Hollywood. Again, you're gonna be able to generate an entire Hollywood film based on your own particular prompt, just like Grok. You're going to be able to generate that within a couple years, where people can just say, make a movie about, Super Mario meets, the battles of World War II, just make it, and it'll generate a full fledged movie and say, make it 2 hours and 10 minutes to the dot, and you'll generate an entire movie fully fledged with voice acting and everything. And think about what that does to destroy what is stardom or what is cinema or what is Hollywood, what is reality, what is an influencer, what is a human. And the more we blur those lines, the more that resentment becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, unless people can turn towards a transcendent like God that they can truly imitate, rather than just become another object to have resentment about in terms of rival factions. What I criticize all the time, this ideological Gnostic approach to Christianity, in which people define their Christianity based on their doctrinal alliances versus do they look and imitate the spirit and likeness of Jesus, which was always what he said it meant to be a follower of him.
Yeah, totally. What you just described there about how this increasingly competitive atmosphere where everything is jumbled together and everything is having to everyone is having to strive against everyone else. This increasingly competitive environment being a uh, very fructive ground for ressentiment. That's a pure Schelerian point that you're making right there. Scheler makes that point, and it's one of the reasons why, in contrast to Nietzsche, who says uh, ressentiment begins with Christianity and Platonism, he associates Christianity and Platonism with ressentiment. Scheler he associates it with some antique schools like the Stoics, he says, are actually victims of ressentiment. But on the whole, he associates it with modernity. He associates the triumph of ressentiment as a psychological phenomenon with modernity and with the bourgeois class. And it's precisely because of what you're saying. Basically, what you had was the bourgeoisie increasingly became competitive with the noble class, right? You had the knights of Europe, and then there was this you know, class with no title, no formal recognition within the system, but who rivaled the nobles increasingly with power because of their monopolization of these new modes of economic exchange. The this kind of new vacuum opened up because of technological advancement, because of these various things, and the bourgeois class emerged to kind of fill this gap. They stepped into the breach where there was basically there was demand for something, and they provided that, and this granted them a kind of power that allowed them to rival the noble class. And so there was increasingly a competitive environment, and that produces ressentiment. This striving, he mentions, Shaler describes in the book how a medieval society, a tiered society with a real hierarchy, is actually not terribly conducive to ressentiment, because you can't really envy the king if you're a peasant. Like, not really. I mean, that's just not how the frame of mind is in those kinds of societies. You can think, oh, the king is bad, the king is doing this or that wrong. You can dislike the king, but you can't envy him. You can't have ressentiment against him, because there's no pretense that you would be on the king's level such that you could deserve what he deserves. But in modernity, there is this, and you see this happen in like the French society prior to the French Revolution. You had them starting to give out noble titles to the bourgeoisie, and these were the people that came to be known as the robe nobles, right, against the sword nobles, who were the people who were the nobles of France going back to the Middle Ages, and inherited noble title by blood. But you had the robe nobles, who were basically just wealthy merchants that were given noble title. And so there was increasingly this caste that viewed itself as deserving of something that it was not being given. And that's really what creates ressentiment. It's not just that um, this person is beautiful, it's also coupled with this belief that, but I should be beautiful too. And the fact that they're beautiful and I'm not, it's almost as if they stole beauty from me. They're the reason I'm not beautiful. This is how ressentiment takes hold. Because you could have someone who's just practices resignation, right? You could have someone who's ugly and they just say, they're beautiful, that's great. I'm not beautiful. That just happened to be how it is. That person's not guilty of ressentiment. It's what allows for ressentiment to take root is what they have, I should have, but I don't. And that means they've taken it from me. So that's what allows for ressentiment, and that allows for the atmosphere, which then precedes about the transvaluation, where you say that thing which they have, which I should have anyways. Secretly, this is the conceit: is that I should have that anyway. They've taken it from me. That's what allows for the devaluation to happen. You can say, well, this isn't valuable to begin with because I can't have it. And so exactly, you're right. The competitiveness of modern society, and the way in which all different races and castes and everything are just jumbled together. This produces a very competitive environment that makes people that's very conducive to ressentiment
Yeah,
taking
and
hold of
and
people's
again,
psychology.
the loss of class differences, um, it's so weird. Everything is getting jumbled. For example, going on a cruise and going in the airplane used to be something of the luxury, of a luxurious thing. And now everybody's in it. And now all those things have become almost passe and vulgar. If you look at the videos of people brawling, dozens and dozens of people brawling all over the cruise line, that was something that, back in the day, boomers dreamed of those kind of luxuries. And now it's become kind of debased, and airlines have become like getting on a bus, like a Greyhound bus in the sky, where it's just dehumanizing and it's pathetic. And people like me who talk about anti-gravity, immediately we're put into, well, you are in the conspiracy camp. It's like people can't even imagine these concepts as they are for themselves, right? Because they've become so cynical that the only time they can dream big or consider someone dreaming big is under the context of conspiracy. Like, well, if you're talking about anti gravity, that means you must believe aliens are real or you believe in the UFO conspiracy of the government. No, I just understand physics in a broader, deeper perspective than the textbook physics that are long past their due date of credibility, right? And so what I'm saying is like so much of that phenomenon that you're talking about, that Rene Girard talks about, and that this gentleman Max Scheler uh, talks about, it's so baked into the fabric of how we think that you can't even begin. It is the water of our fishbowl, as we like to say. You can't even see it almost, and it is what is ruining virtually everything. It's this incessant mimetic desire, this inability to be content with one's being. But, as Rene Girard would say, to desire another's being is primarily what is driving what you are referring to as resentment and what he calls mimetic desire, because you ultimately want to be that. There's something about that other that is irresistibly reflective of the image of God in a unique spark because they are distinct from you, that it is irresistible to someone who does not recognize and find gratitude in their own divine spark and reflection of God. And they can't be grateful for that. They can't be content. And what the Bible calls to abide in that, that's what that concept's about. Abide is a weird word that feels kind of like not relevant, unless you're watching The Dude, uh, you know, this idea of abiding. But abide is this idea of kind of letting yourself free from that resentment, rat race, and rivalry and undifferentiated chaos that we're all experiencing. You were mentioning earlier that, all these beautiful women are going to a more select group of high performers as the middle class is destroyed and people are being, neutered by the water and food and everything else that they're drinking. They can't even, people are having erectile dysfunction at 20 years old. They're having colon cancer at 10 years old. I mean, these are old man disease. Why is this happening? It is a very bug man's life, if you want to use that word. It's very, everything's getting, not a bug does not describe it. It's a rotten decay, and this drive towards death that ultimately underpins so much of this consumeristic society that we live in. Um, and it's hard to see what is the way to get the masses to wake up, because there's a reason why my show is not, doing, the numbers of the astroturfed influencers that are very effective mouthpieces for government and parties and so forth. And that's because we try to bring peace and create solutions that don't require this spirit of resentment to be to be flourishing. We try to take that resentment and discharge it into safe places, and that's why my show is called A Neighbor's Choice, and things hidden, a reference to Rene Girard's quote of the gospel, and A Neighbor's Choice is an apocalyptic Mister Rogers for adults, because we're trying to take all that mad that people feel and discharge it into a safe environment like creativity and art and things like that. And that seems so outdated from the world of resentment that you're talking about. How do we get back? How do we make the world more like my show? Because everything that we've talked about is becoming like what everybody talks about. We're always ahead of the game. We've been having Dr. Yu on for a long time. He's making his challenges about establishment physics, and now the whole world's starting to realize he's right as he goes on to other shows that are more algorithmically supportive for warmongers and able to spread his message of physics critiques. We were right about things like seed oils before it was cool. We were right about all the mimetic theory, all these things. And I'm not saying that, obviously there's a little bit of competitive funness with that, but and humor, but ultimately what I'm saying is like people are not hungry. And I know that there is a niche for it. Obviously you're doing your own podcast, but people in general are not hungering for a place to healthily resolve their resentments towards their rivals or their rival race or their rival immigrants and these people or that people. They don't want to resolve it. They want to fight, or they want to fight through someone. Thankfully, the social media kind of allows them to kind of transfuse some of that violence, but in some ways it also stokes it.
Yeah, that's a great point. The point you made about abiding, I wanted to return to that because that's a really key thing. Shaler talks about this distinction between, this is in the first chapter, it's the sociology of ressentiment, um, or something like that. The psychology. It's a wonderful book because it's talking about theology, sociology, psychology, history of how modernity arose. It's really like it's a tiny book. It's very, very slim, but it's really it punches way above its weight. But what he talks about, this distinction he makes, there's a psychological distinction he makes between the people he calls common and the people he calls noble. This is a psychological distinction. The people that are common only perceive inequalities in any other person because they're comparing themselves to that person. The only way they perceive inequalities is through the act of comparison. It's not, it's literally like perception is posteriori to comparison. So that's the common man. Common man can only perceive value in things through comparing himself to it. And this is a precondition for ressentiment. There are two ways the common man can go. There's one way he calls it's a French term, it's arriviste. We would say in English like the striver, and then there's the man of ressentiment. The striver doesn't perceive the inherent value in anything. He just pursues things because he sees other people have them. And so he can maybe even achieve the things that he sees other people and wants on that basis, but he doesn't actually perceive their intrinsic value. He just wants them because other people have them. And so that's the striver. The man of ressentiment is too impotent to achieve the things that he sees other people have. And so uh, then there's this whole process of devaluation where he says, well, these things aren't good to begin with. That's ressentiment. But both of those are common archetypes. They're not spiritually noble. And what Taylor calls the nobleman is someone who can do exactly what you just said. He can abide in himself. So he says the person who is noble has this immediate perception of his own value. You could say, if we wanted to put it in theological language, he immediately perceives himself as made in the image and likeness of God, as made in the image of God. It's just this experience is just like the bedrock of his whole experience of the world. And so he doesn't need to compare himself to things in order to perceive their value. He just perceives their value immediately. It doesn't mean he doesn't compare himself, but it's not required for him to see the value in things. That's the nobleman. So the nobleman has this kind of rock at the bottom of his subjectivity, which is just the immediate perception of his own value. So he can see someone who's maybe more handsome than him, stronger than him, better than him in any number of ways, maybe better than him entirely. Like he's just, more beautiful, stronger, more intelligent. And what Scheler says is remarkable. He says the person who's truly noble in disposition would not have his own sense of self-value undermined like one iota by his perception of someone who is absolutely like better than him in every way he can perceive. His own sense of value would not be changed by that in any way, which is just remarkable. And the fact that that's such a weird, that's going to sound so strange to so many people, is evidence that our society has been eroded by
That's why
ressentiment.
my show
There's
is an
no
odd
ability for
duck.
people to.
Yeah, because we talk about win-win solutions, which is it's a simple practical application to that state of mind that you're describing, right? Which is that when you love yourself, you are able to then love your neighbor as yourself, right? You cannot truly have a healthy love for your neighbor or relationship to your neighbor if you do not have a healthy love for yourself.
And you can see these archetypes at play in our society, particularly the common ones, the striver and the man of ressentiment. You have the archetype of the hustler, and everyone kind of knows there's something cringeworthy about the hustler, but I think it's related to this perception that he's common. He has a vulgar mind. He doesn't really truly appreciate things. He strives after them, maybe with great ferocity, but it's kind of foolish and comes off as cringeworthy because he's not actually desiring that thing for its actual intrinsic value, but just because he wants to, impress other people to prove his own worth to himself.
Mhm. Yeah, and I was just to make the point that that's why God says to love your neighbor as yourself, because you have to first love yourself, right, in order to have a healthy love for your neighbor. And that kind of provides that nobility that you were talking about in Scheller's models that he's writing about, which is this idea of the one that is content with their unique, gifts and things from God. And it's interesting how, with I know the Scheller doesn't get into the sociology and the collective and the anthropology as much, but with the Rene Girard layer to it, you have envy as this kind of driving desire, which includes this resentment concept. And then you have in that envy, when it spreads its fruit, it produces sacrificial violence and it produces stagnation because if people are in a constant state of one-upmanship and rivalry, they're not able to solve problems and actually be productive. They become mired in competition for competition's sake, right? That's one of the reasons why John Rockefeller said competition is a sin, because it does bring out wastefulness and that slothfulness because you're working for working's sake rather than working for the productivity of serving your fellow human beings. And so whether it's the endless, um, you know, poor quality rivalry for rivalry's sake, or it's the violence in the form of scapegoating type gestures, envy spreads this entire violent cascade. And it's interesting how there's this other fruit of the spirit called gratitude. And when you have gratitude, that thankfulness spreads when you really own that deeply in the way you live and practice your thought life. That gratitude gives way to creativity and the alleviation of that common uh, one-upmanship that we're so sick and tired of, but we're all kind of enthralled into because and Scheller doesn't get into the sticky nature of mimetic desire as much, and how it spreads contagiously and things, but this idea that these things transmit like contagions, and when you have a whole society that's just stewing in resentment and having all of this built up, you know, disgust that's actually a disguise for a desire for their being, this lack of something ontologically is really all about a denial of the true self that Christ models for people. That God loves us and he loves us for who we are, and he loves, and we have plenty of opportunity to be creative from that fountain. So envy is the seed that produces violence and stagnation, which produces more violence. And then gratitude is the seed that produces productivity, creativity, nonviolence, getting along with people, respect, you know, having a win-win mindset, which is ultimately what Jesus is talking about when he does these performative prophecies like the fish and loaves being multiplied. This is this picture that we're going to move into a post-scarcity perspective one day, that hopefully will be an example of our hearts not being so driven by that resentment, that all-consuming resentment, like you say.
Yeah, I think what you said there about abundance is really interesting because Shaler talks about in this book, basically he's describing Christian love, and he says Christian love, contrary to what Nietzsche says, that it emerges from ressentiment, which is an inner dearth, right? Nietzsche says ressentiment is the product of a declining life. He talks about the worm. He says when the worm is stepped on, it doubles up. And he says that's clever, right? It's a survival strategy for the weak, right? To appear small. Oh, I don't want to have power over you. I actually believe in humility. I believe in love. It's actually like a backhanded way of trying to get power because, you recognize you can't have a face-to-face, manly confrontation. So you try and say, oh, this isn't, I don't do that. I'm not about that. So that would be ressentiment. That's how ressentiment can emerge from a kind of self-hatred, a kind of inadequacy. Um, and this kind of sick form of love, which you see in a lot of the left in world history, the political phenomena of the left in world history is laced with ressentiment. Whether it's the bourgeois class or some of the later copycat, revolutions, which look back to the French Revolution, there's this real strain of ressentiment masked as a kind of love for humanity, which is really born in a contempt of self. They hate themselves, and so they flee from themselves into other people, and this becomes, you know, this becomes construed as altruism and whatever. In contrast to all of that, Taylor says Christian love is born of an inner abundance that just overflows to even the bottom, the abyss of reality, right? There's this inner abundance that wells up in a person who has been transformed by Christ, frankly, who can as a result be noble. Their own value is not in question, and so they're not having to prove it to themselves or others or try and justify their own existence. They're secure in themselves, and so they have this inner abundance to um, offer that can even slip down into the very lowest parts of reality, which is, I mean, that's the culmination of that is the crucifixion, right? Um, Christ descending into death, the Son of God, the word through whom all things were made descends into the to non-being, to the closest you can get to non-being, which is death, the grave, where things decompose, they lose their identity, they lose their being, their coherence. So that kind of love, this kind of overflowing love, Shaler he associates with the kind of inner security and inner abundance of self, of overflowing love, where love itself is the end. It's not a means to an end. And he also says, um, so he says that's different from the classical view of love. So if you look at Aristotle or the Hellenic view of love, love in that paradigm, he says, it's vertical, it's ascending. And he's not totally denying the validity of this conception. He says it's beautiful, but he says it's lacking something. In the ancient classical view, uh, take like for instance Aristotle. In everything, according to its nature, there is a desire that impels it up towards imitating the prime mover, which is the self-complete reality, needing of nothing. And it's basically all of reality tries to emulate. It's interesting we talk about memetics. In an Aristotelian framework, all of reality, according to its nature, is emulating the deity, which is the prime mover. And their nature is actually constituted by how well they're emulating the prime mover. So there are things that are closer to the prime mover and things that are less close. And this is true among men as well. And so you have this stratification of castes of men, according to their nature, which is basically to say in accordance with their ability to emulate the deity. And so love in this perception is eros. It's like a striving love.
Mhm.
Love in this conception is based on need. You see something you need or desire, and that compels you to love. So Shaler, that's how he conceptualized classical love. It's the striving of those who have a lack that they seek to fill towards that which has that thing that they seek to fill themselves with. So it's a kind of love is born of need. The lesser always loves the higher in this kind of ascending hierarchy, this kind of, you could think of this pyramid structure up towards the thing which needs nothing, the prime mover, which moves everything like the way a beautiful woman moves a man. It's like it's a kind of it draws something out in the it draws through desire, it draws something out of the lower thing, which impels it to move towards the higher thing. That's the classical notion of love. And Taylor, he contrasts that with the Christian notion. He doesn't say it's that the classical notion is totally valueless, but he contrasts it in this following way. He says, let us compare this with the Christian conception. In that conception, there takes place what might be called a reversal in the movement of love. He says, the Christian view boldly denies the Greek axiom that love is an aspiration of the lower towards the higher. So this is the key Christian thing. Love is not an aspiration of the lower towards the higher in the Christian conception. At least not Christian love is not this. It says, on the contrary, the criterion of love is that the nobler stoops to the vulgar, the healthy to the sick, the rich to the poor, the handsome to the ugly, the good and saintly to the bad and common, the Messiah to sinners and publicans. The Christian is not afraid, like the ancient, that he might lose something by doing so, that he might impair his own nobility. He acts in the peculiar pious conviction that through his condescension, through his abasement and self-renunciation, he gains the highest good. He gains the highest good and becomes equal to God. Change in the motion of the change in the notion of God and his fundamental relation to man in the world is not the cause, but the consequence of this reversal in the movement of love. God is no longer the eternal unmoving goal like a star, for the love of all things, moving the world as the beloved moves the lover. Now, the very essence of God is to love and serve. Creating, willing, and acting are derived from these original qualities. The eternal first mover of the world is replaced by the Creator, who created it out of love. An event that is monstrous for the man of antiquity, that is absolutely paradoxical according to his axioms, is supposed to have taken place in Galilee. God spontaneously descended to man, became a servant, and died the bad servant's death on the cross. Now the precept of loving good and hating evil, loving one's friend and hating one's enemy, becomes meaningless. There is no longer any highest good independent of and beyond the act and movement of love. Love itself is the highest of all goods. The summum bonum is no longer the value of a thing, but of an act, the value of love itself as love, not for its results and achievements. Christmas is this movement that Shaler's describing. It's the high descending to the low, right? The principle of all reality becomes a baby in a feeding trough, and then eventually a dead man buried in a tomb. First humiliated and crucified, and and So that's precisely this movement of the high stooping to the low out of this inner overflowing abundance, not of a lack, like Nietzsche says. It's not born of love is not born of a lack. True love is not born of a lack. True love is born of an inner abundance that can't but overflow as low as you possibly can go, right? Um, it's true love is born of an inner abundance which overflows into the abyss. That's how God created the world, and that's how God saved the world, which depending on your conception, maybe these are the same thing, but that's how God created the world. That's how God saved the world. He descended uh, at Christmas. That's what Christmas is. It's the nativity of Christ. It's him being born. It's the point of contact between uh, highest and the lowest, um, between one realm and the other, because the higher realm, it's not consumed in itself. It's not enclosed in itself in its own perfection, but because of its perfection, it overflows down to the lower realm and ennobles the lower realm with its own nobility that it possesses in itself. So love is ennobling. Love is born of a security in love. More love begets more love, and that's because love facilitates this solidity in the person, which allows them to have an inner abundance that permits them to not play this game, this rat race game of either denying the value of worldly goods or not understanding the value of worldly goods and just kind of voraciously grasping at them endlessly. Love is what allows us to avoid that. Love is ennobling. And Christmas is like a sublime symbol of that, of God stooping to man, of the perfect overflowing into the imperfect because it's perfect.
And yet, a lot of people feel like Christianity or churches tend to be asleep at the wheel in terms of understanding what time it is and how to properly address those incels and those resentiment consumed people and all the different compounding problems that everybody feels mired in that drives them to go back to their endless competition. So, what would be your Christmas wish for that? How do you resolve that? How do you actually, as a human being, besides, the personal piety things that are they're kind of easy to list off, but hard to practice, obviously, but what's something that people can look forward to, maybe to have something to be a part of, to incarnate this love that you're describing?
That's a very interesting question. Well, I would say definitely we need to, hmm, I was going to say we need to seek after this inner security that he talks about that makes a person noble and thus capable of this overflowing love. But of course, we kind of you don't need to seek it. It's something that seeks you, which doesn't mean you don't do anything uh, to move in that direction. You can, but once you have it, it's something that kind of has sought you, or that's the sense, or you didn't have to like grasp at it. So maybe that's a complex thing to say. We need to seek this inner ennobling certainty or self value or something. That's maybe not what I exactly want to say. What I would say is we need to, if we really want to begin like the process of overcoming, I think, the staleness of Christianity, part of it is going to be recognizing this distinction between ressentiment and Christian love because they've really become blurred together. And this is why, the kind of anti-Christian right or the Christian ambivalent right has its points because in many ways, Christianity has been entangled with ressentiment. And Scheler talks about this. He says this is why Nietzsche originally made his error. Part of why he made his error is the Christians in his day, particularly in his time and place, but particularly in his place, but just generally in his day. You can see this with like certain Lutheran figures of, in Nietzsche's contemporary surroundings, but that Christianity had been taken over with ressentiment and a kind of bourgeois ethos. And it kind of just melded together and become indistinguishable for people. And he says that's part of why Nietzsche originally made his error of assuming Christian love was born of a kind of weakness and a declining life and ressentiment. So I think if we're going to begin to heal the damage that is kind of modernity has done to Christianity, you could say, or the emergence of this new system of values, which Shaler calls in the book like modern humanitarian values, if we're going to begin to heal the damage to, you could say like not just Christianity's like reputation, but to our own psychology, because as you mentioned earlier, like we're all like contaminated by this system of thinking. And that's something Shalo talks about too. Gerard talks about how envy is contagious, but Shalo talks about how ressentiment is contagious as well. If we're going to begin to heal our psychologies and also heal Christianity's perception of itself, understanding of itself, and people's perception of it, we need to begin to like be like the sword that divides. That we need to begin to divide the wheat from the chaff, and really interrogate our own disposition um, about these things, and think about our motivations. Why is it that I feel this way? Why is it I'm acting this way? Is it really out of an inner abundance and a love that just cannot contain itself and overflows, or is it really regarded in a contempt for myself and an emptiness? And I think that it begins with that personal interrogation of yourself and your motivations. Um, but in terms of like a broader movement, like I think we need me and my friend, he goes by Noesis. He's a very bright guy. He actually wrote I think it's a master's thesis on John Scotus Eriugena, who's this great Christian philosopher of the early Middle Ages. But he made this point that there's this lacuna in Christian discourse. He made this point in our first episode on the Scheler book. There's this lacuna, there's this gap in Christian discourse that needs to be filled. And uh, I think this can begin to be filled by uh, a kind of we need a new kind of Christian thinking that's kind of maybe a bridge between this kind of more we basically need a kind of rapprochement with Nietzsche in some ways, I think, because he is one of the most potent critics of Christianity. David Bentley Hart, in his book The Beauty of the Infinite, he makes the point that like Nietzsche really throws down a gauntlet that we have to pick up. The gauntlet is basically Nietzsche says all of reality is essentially violence. And Christianity says, no, you're right. Christianity, most of the world is violence, but we represent peace. And Nietzsche's kind of critique is that, wouldn't it just be more simple to say, this is an expression of violence as well? Christianity is an expression of violence. And what's worse, it's ugly violence. Unlike the beautiful violence of the Homeric hero and the Hellenic tragic ethos, unlike this kind of beautiful violence, Dionysus, we have this kind of decrepit, sickly violence of Christianity. And Hart really tries in that book to show Christianity as more beautiful than Nietzsche's vision, and also free of the contamination of you could say, violence as Nietzsche conceives it. Um, and what we need to do is kind of contend with these criticisms of Nietzsche as a kind of principle wherein the wheat and the chaff can be sifted, and we can begin to really understand the Christian ethos as decontaminated uh, from disentangled from the kind of spirit of the age, for the past few hundred years, which has increasingly been ressentiment. You could talk about its various permutations in like the bourgeoisie and the post-war consensus, and then these various things. I think in terms of a movement you could be a part of that could begin to uh, transform things in a positive direction, I think it's going to involve us contending seriously with uh, Nietzsche as a kind of foil, as a kind of way for us to purify ourselves of kinds of ugliness that has produced the world we live in, which is so ugly in so many ways. And Christianity, particularly Christmas, chose the beauty of a new and alternative way, which is not ressentiment, but overflowing love, abundance, abundant love.
I like the idea that God, understands our baser approach to perceiving him. And he, in his grace, permits us to construct false concepts about him in order to find him attractive. Nietzsche talks about how man is like a woman towards the gods. And he wants a warrior that is scarce in his love in order to find attraction towards it. And God has permitted us to create all these monstrous distortions about what he really did, particularly when he went to the cross. He's allowed us to distort this into these insanely off the mark distortions that are much more akin to paganism than anything beautiful that God was about. And he's permitted it, I think, as a kind of grace to say, well, if this is what it takes for humanity and its crassness to get 1 inch towards me, then that's what they'll have to do until they're able to get past that. And he keeps pushing us towards a better place, and we keep, taking selfies with the tent where Charlie Kirk was assassinated, and it's like, no, you've got it all wrong. Let the dead bury the dead. God is the God of the living, and that includes not being that social climbing, grimy little spirit that we tend to fall back into of trying to worship our martyrs and worship our heroes and, put them as gods and cast them back down whenever they're scandalized. All of this stuff is this hard to get God that we like to emulate. You know what I'm saying? What I'm trying to say is like, we want our heroes to be with fireworks and glitz and glamour and wealth and golden toilets and all this stuff because we want a hard to get God because that's the kind of approach that we treat each other as in our little games of envy. We play these games of striving and whether you're pretending to be an ally of the poor and downtrodden like the old reigning religion that we call left, or you're one of these wannabe contenders to the left on the right, all I see is a worship of death and power. You know what I mean? I don't see, I see Christianity used as a talisman, like from those 80s movies where you go into the dusty old library and you uncover this talisman and it's like, oh, look what I've got. And you kind of wield it around as an object. Oh, I am Christian and we're going to have Christendom and we're going to use violent force and we're going to have a little Caesar come and save us. And it's just, it's so, I understand all of people's little uh, stories, how they get to that spot, but it still doesn't impress me as very, impressive to that this is the best people can come up with. But, God is, Renee had a quote. He said, you know, God died for us unconditionally, and we could scarcely care because we're more transfixed by a supermodel's gaze walking by us at the beach or something or at the mall. We're transfixed by the hard to get. And that's one of the reasons why the idea of a God loving us unconditionally, even unto laying down his life, is so abundant. It has no hard to get energy to it, which makes us devalue it, right? So we take it for granted. We turn it into an ideology to battle Catholic versus Orthodox versus Protestant versus all the little schisms in between each of those camps, inside those camps. And that's all we do as our identity in Christianity. We don't even begin to try to actually practice unconditional love and grace to our neighbors or, fellow Christians or fellow rivals, much less other nations overseas that we yawn as we bomb and destroy and displace, and don't even bat an eye really in terms of, the visceral atrocities that we are kind of co-participating in when we continue to vote and hire people that do these things. Um, so I'm going on a little bit of a tangent, but I was just thinking, it just made me think about some of those things that are circulating right now in the zeitgeist.
Yeah. Yeah, that point you made about abundant unconditional love being devalued because it's too accessible or too seemingly accessible is very interesting.
Yeah, it's what the kids would call simp. That God is a
Yeah,
simp for man, Not that it's the same, but they would try to paint it in that light.
right. Yeah, yeah. And that's part of why Nietzsche says it's like he associates it with ressentiment because he views Christianity as like a coping mechanism for the weak.
Right.
Oh, you believe in a unconditionally loving God, who loves you unto the abyss. Really, because you're not fully you're not potent. You don't have an inner potency, so you need to. It's an imaginary solace and an imaginary revenge for the people that are weak and feeble. Um,
But
you know,
really, it was the
uh,
passion. The passion displays the petty crowd nature of those who are would be Nietzscheans, because the crowd is swept up in all of these little what I mean by Nietzsche is a critique of Christianity as something vulgar and common that appeals to the bug people or whatever. Because ultimately, the power of the crowd to pull you in pulls in all of even Jesus's followers, and it's interesting that, the desire to have resentment for Jesus and envy towards Jesus and fear that the crowd displays for Jesus is something very common. And their desire to save Barabbas, and I always think it's so fascinating that the early text had Barabbas's name as Jesus Barabbas because it's so obvious what's going on there. You have Jesus. It's like, which Yeshua of the Father do you want to follow? Like, which one is truly of God? The one who says, love your enemies out of this, like you said, this abundance of love that emanates from your own being, or, take out your oppressors by force, like this other Yeshua Barabbas that is Bar of Abba the Father, Barabbas, Yeshua of the Father, this Barabbas who comes from the father of lies, who says that violence and sacrificial vengeance is the only way to get back um, at the oppressors of the people. And the crowd chooses to save Barabbas. They say he's of the Father, and the nonviolent Jesus who says you're good, be great, practice gratitude, and out of that abundance comes love for others. That one's the one they say to kill, right? And they're still killing them every day. Every time they want to go along with destroying their political opponents and killing everybody that disagrees with them and imprisoning everybody and bombing these people and starving these people, you've just got this raging, frothing spirit of the crowd calling for Barabbas and then going to church and taking the Eucharist and acting like they're a Christian. They're not. They're not. They may be, I'm not talking about it soteriologically. That's what they talk about all the time. I'm talking about it in the nature of the thing. That's not the imitation of Jesus at all. Jesus was practicing a spirit of nonviolence, and like you said, this this inner abundance of being, the living water, that never that that will never run dry, or will quench your being. That this idea that he's talking about and describing in his conversations with people is what we're talking about today.
Have you there's this book by Giuseppe Fornari, A God Torn to Pieces. He was a friend of Girard's. It's basically kind of a biography of Nietzsche. It's like a it's like a biography of Nietzsche, and it kind of actually does, I think, some original work on like the origins of his insanity, and then kind of gives a theological evaluation of Nietzsche as like a person. And it's quite sympathetic to him in certain ways. It's not anti-Nietzsche in like a superficial way. But have you heard of that book? Because I know a lot of Girardians are a fan of that book.
It sounds familiar. Yeah, I've heard of it. I haven't read it, and the name sounds familiar as well. The author. I
Hmm.
wanted to ask you, what did you want to be when you were a child, as a little kid?
That's a good question. Um, my earliest memory of what I wanted to be was a paleontologist. A lot of kids want to be a paleontologist, but there's a commonality with I think that's maybe worth mentioning in my case because there is like a commonality with uh paleontology and like how my interest developed as I got older because I'm very much interested in like past, at base I'm kind of a history guy. My whole interest in philosophy, theology, etc. really is like at base kind of emerged from my interest in history. So in some ways, like I still kind of want to be a paleontologist. I want to be a paleontologist of like how the human mind developed through time. So yeah. So that was me as a kid.
That's fascinating. And so, did you ever have like a favorite thing you wanted for Christmas for a toy, like a paleontology kit, like Jurassic Park branded or something that you saw on television?
It's a good question. What did I want? It's a gift. Um, I definitely liked going to museums.
Uh,
That was a I did that. My parents took me to museums a lot. We had a I don't need a we had a big museum where I lived, and I went there a lot. That was a big occasion for me. Um, so yeah, that consistent, interest in the past and how it informs the present or differed from the present or whatnot. I think that's a very it's a it's interesting. You asked me that. I never thought about it before. I never connected my interest in paleontology as a child to like the other stuff I came to be interested in later in life. But I think that is a connection. And so yeah, paleontology, going to museums, those were things from my childhood. Yeah.
so you were searching for the origin of everything, or did you just like dinosaurs, or like?
Yeah,
If,
I think it was both. I was interested in how like things changed over time, whether it's like organisms and like how organisms were related to each other. People talk about, I mean, it's the genealogy of morals, right? Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. It's like it's and so that genealogical theme is there when you're talking about paleontology, how organisms are related to each other, how this organism is like that organism, the different phyla and genera, how Aristotle defines different organisms into these different, I think this kind of Russian nesting doll of categories. That was always interesting to me. And also, I mean, there's also just the all kids like dinosaurs, right? So there was that as well. But I think it was both of them. Yeah.
what's the strangest thing you've seen? You said you've been to Africa and all these other countries, right? I mean, how many countries have you been to? What's the strangest thing you can think of, or just an odd moment?
Um,
It was an animal crossing the road, or something strange that happened, or a bizarre phenomenon.
yeah. So I work for this organization called First Things Foundation, headed by a guy named John here. He's a very interesting guy, lovely guy. I think you'd like to talk to him. But so at first I got sent to Sierra Leone, which is a West African country. Now I'm in the Georgian Republic, Sakartvelo. But I was in Sierra Leone. And so I had some very interesting experiences there. So first of all, um, every night at like 7 p.m., you'd start hearing drums. And these are the drums of what's called, I think it's the Sunday Society. It's basically like the men's fraternity. It's like a ritual fraternity. It's associated with these kind of coming of age rituals. These kind of rituals associated with manhood in like the local African religious traditions. There's the I think it's Sunday is for men, and then you have Bondo for women. And I have an interesting story about the Bondo Society. There was one time I was like a little tipsy, I was a little drunk, and I traipsed across the rice field, separating where I lived from the other side of the this valley. This was in Kailao, Sierra Leone, Kailao district. And I traipsed across this rice field, and I was, admiring the palm trees and whatever. And there was this little girl named Sarah who kind of latched onto me, and she was like, "Oh no, the white man is wandering around. We got to make sure he doesn't get in trouble or whatever." So she kind of ersatz became my tour guide. And there was a time where I was like, admiring this palm, and then I was turning around to go walk up this mountain because it was, there were more palms and more beautiful things and interesting stuff up there. And so I turned around and go do this, and she was like, don't go, do not go there, do not go this way. And I was like, I was like, why? And she was like, Bondo, Bondo? And it's the Bondo Society where women have these kind of coming of age rituals. Um, and they practice, it's typically called like female genital mutilation, right? It's associated with this society, whatever, but it's also associated with just like the general things like a woman needs to do to like and note in order to become a wife and whatever. So it's all kind of married together in the practices of the society. So that's a cool anecdote. Another one would be so the drums every night that I mentioned that you hear routinely, they're played by what are called by the locals devils. That's not like a white man's term for these people. They're called devils by the locals. In Creole, which is an offshoot of English, they call them debuden, like devils. Is literally what it means, and it comes from the English word devil. Um, but there was a time when I was sitting with my Mende teacher, like under the like out on the veranda, right outside of my mud brick hut house. My Mende teacher was like explaining to me we were reading something in Creole, and he was like, I was like, we came across the word devil, and I was like, what do these refer to? And he's like, and I'm like, are those the devils that you like that parade around in town? because they do these parades down like Main Street of the town of Kailan. Um, and he's like, uh, for you as a white man to know about this is an abomination. So that was a cool like eerie moment, ominous moment. He's like, for you as a white man to know about the devils is an abomination. But yeah, so maybe that would be those would be two cool anecdotes from my travels. Um, uh, I've been to Mount Ushba in Georgia, which is the second tallest mountain in the Caucasus, I believe. Mount Ushba. Uh, you say Ushbisimta, Ushbisimta, Mount Ushba. But that was cool. Um, looks like a giant dragon tooth jutting out of the earth. Um, yeah, I could recount more
Did you
stories, but
dig for bones
yeah.
or see strange animals anywhere?
I'm interested in like cryptozoology. Oh, I have a story I could tell you about. So my friend Seth, or I should maybe say, I don't know. Yeah, Seth. He when he like got to Sierra Leone, I overlapped with him for like 3 months. And when he got to Sierra Leone, he like 2 weeks after getting there, he was in his so you have to sleep under a mosquito net in Sierra Leone. And he was sleeping in his room 2 weeks after getting there, and he heard this like I don't even know how to make the sound. It's like it was like a tapping noise. It was like a rapid tapping noise on his wall. I don't know if you could hear that or whatever, but there was this rapid tapping noise on his wall, uh, and it was like quite loud. And he because he's a dude from the South and he's just kind of gung ho in a way maybe I wouldn't be. He like got out from under his mosquito net and turned on his flashlight, and there was this like giant, like the size of his hand, insect on his wall that was like black and yellow, and it had these giant flexing mandibles. And it wasn't a spider. It didn't have enough legs to be a spider. It had 6 legs. Um, whereas arachnids and spiders said they have 8 legs, but it had these 6 legs and these two giant mandibles that it was flexing, and it was scuttling along the wall. And so he went back to bed. He wakes up the next day and he asks the locals about it. Like, he describes it to them and he's like, "What is this?" And he's like, the response he got was, "That's not a spider, and if it bites you, you shall surely die." Right? So he goes back to his room at the end of the day, to sleep, and he hears it the same. He hears it again. Hears the bug going around his room at night as well on the walls, crawling on the walls. He hears it for a full week, like a full week's worth of nights. This happens, and he then finally it goes away. But what's interesting is he looked into like what this bug was, and he literally couldn't find anything about it. Like he looked high and low for information about what this bug was, like what it was, and he couldn't find anything. So he like became convinced like it was an undocumented species. Um, so he told me that early when I got to Sierra Leone, and it definitely freaked me out. So
Did you consider that a crypto animal?
he thinks so, or he thought so, at least last time I talked to him, because he couldn't find anything about it, and it didn't look like any other bug he'd seen. Like it wasn't a spider, but it was, yeah, strange creature.
Do you believe in like the Bigfoot and things like that?
Um, Actually, there's an interview on the Telos Bound channel me and my friends did with Jonathan Pajot, and my friend Nate asks Pajot if he believes in Bigfoot. So maybe my answer would be the same as Pajot's. Like, of course, Bigfoot exists. Of course, Santa Claus exists. Of course, Bigfoot exists. All these things exist. Just it's a question of how they exist. What level of reality they exist at. Um, so, I mean, if you look at like monsters in medieval manuscripts, or even like dragons, right? They're this amalgamation of different kinds of things, and that's gesticulating towards like the phenomena of ambiguity, right? Something is ambiguous when you can't quite place it into a category. And so monsters exist, things like Bigfoot exist as at bare minimum as monsters, as in the category of ambiguous things that you can't quite pin down. And so the fact that like
Well, that's the highbrow answer. You know you believe in Bigfoot. That's okay. You can say it. He's real, right? It's
yeah,
okay.
Bigfoot's real, Santa's real. Yeah, of
And
course,
they
all
actually
of these
could
things
be
are
real
real.
too, in other words, right? As a species, not just as an amalgamation of our bumps in the night, right?
Who knows? Who knows? The world is a strange place.
What do you
Truth
think
is
is
stranger than
behind this
fiction.
UFO phenomenon when everybody's talking about this have you heard of this buka ball, this in Colombia that fell out of hit a
But
power line and it looks like something from Power Rangers. It has symbols on it and stuff.
that's very fascinating. I haven't heard of that specifically, but my take on the U.S. UFO phenomena would be similar to the take I just gave about Bigfoot, in that there's probably like a number of phenomena that are kind of congealing in our experience phenomenologically into this one category, or this category of ambiguity, ambiguous things. And so I think there's it's obviously based on people's experiences of things, but I think the fact that it's this kind of it's a conspiracy, or it's this ambiguous thing we don't quite have the answers to, or things seem elusive, or the fact that it's the phenomenon of UFOs exists in this kind of category of ambiguity is maybe uh is maybe indicative of the fact that it's that kind of phenomena. It's like monsters, or it's angels, or it's like, is it government technology? Is it like weapons tech that we're not being let on about? Like what? And there's all these things congealing into this like mythos. And I think that's like generally how these kinds of categories emerge. Monsters, aliens, they tend to emerge from these ambiguous phenomena that seem to congeal into one category, but they're multiplicitous and strange. And yeah, I don't have a
Yeah.
better answer for you than that, I think, on the UFO question.
No,
I
that's
haven't
interesting.
done my due diligence.
Oh, it's interesting. I appreciate your time. Would you have any other final thoughts or you can share how do people can read your content or your podcast shows or anything else you'd like to tell people about?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Olocardia, OLO at OLOKARDIA, Olocardia at Olocardia. You can find me there. You can find my Substack, substack.com/allheart1. That's just all heart, one word, no space, all lowercase, and then just the number one, all heart one. Um, on Substack, my Substack publication is entitled Omnicordia. We also have a Discord server by that name that's kind of invite only. If you're an interesting person who's interested in any of the stuff that David talks about or that we talked about in this conversation, just hit me up and I'll let you in. Um, so that's where you can find me. Um, I guess my final comment would just be, disentangle ressentiment from Christian love. Really interrogate when you feel something that you think is love towards something. Why do you feel it? Like what's ultimately at in the looming in the background of that motivation? And just remember that like love comes from a kind of inner abundance, not a kind of inner weakness. So maybe that's what I would say. And
And I
Merry
would get
Christmas as well.
I would guess you're probably an optimistic about the future and you're probably pro technology I know that's a complicated word but for people but
This is a so you actually you put your finger on a kind of intellectual frailty of mine. I haven't really fleshed out an opinion on technology. Like I broadly find sort of archaeofuturist ideas appealing. I think ultimately I kind of agree with a kind of biblical narrative whereby like in the Bible, you go from the garden to the city, right? From Genesis in the garden to the city in the book of Revelation. And of course, it's the city, that descends from heaven, whose builder is God. But as we know from Christ, God is the God man. And this actually relates to the cosmism question, which we didn't discuss in this conversation, but God works through human hands. He synergizes with man. He doesn't just impose things on reality. He draws out the creative capacities latent in reality, the chief locus of which is man. And so I think technology, I generally agree with Pajot's kind of techno ambivalent perspective. I think I've recourse to a lot of the Enochic literature and a lot of the commentaries on the Book of Genesis and the role technology plays there. And there is this kind of basically what I would say is technology is a very much a double-edged sword. It's just the way to understand technology is it's something external to us, which in some way enhances our capacity. And so that's kind of neutral. It can go either way. Um, but there's this tendency as a result, like technology on its own is neutral, but because of the nature of man as he is, there's a real tendency for it to become like an idol. And then you get the idol of the beast, which speaks in Revelation and whatnot. And so I'm kind of techno ambivalent. I think it can be, and I would say what's more is there's technology is very much going in a kind of dangerous direction. You could see John Vervaeke, the way he uh, views AI and its development as a very grave matter that he seeks to like he feels like he needs to rapidly like exert influence to kind of right the ship on AI and its potential directions. He'd be someone to look to on that. But I basically I'd say technology in its own right is just an enhancement of man's capacity, which can lead to the glorification of God, the beautification of creation. You know, creation is better as a result of like I'm in Georgia here. There's beautiful stone carved churches. There's this strong tradition of techne in human culture that is constitutive of human culture, and that can beautify the world, that can make the world better. But all too often it goes the other direction, and I think we're at a precipice now where technology can rapidly get far worse than any previous technology has been in terms of the way it impacts society sociologically at scale. So we're in a very dangerous time. I would say I'm not a optimist. I would say I'm not. I know Jacques Ellul has this kind of techno pessimist perspective. Um, I wouldn't have that kind of perspective on it. I think technology can be good, but it can also be highly destructive. And I think we're kind of maybe going down the wrong path as of late with the technology question. And we have the capacity to unmake ourselves and destroy our anything recognizably um, identifiable as human existence more so than at any time previous. I mean, really, truly.
Yeah, but somebody's got to build that city and make it float down from heaven.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Someone's got to do it.
All right, I
Um,
appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.